Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. We have been reading from Jerry Oppenheimer's book, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and the Dark Side of the Dream. This was published by St. Martin's Press in 2015. Chapter 22, Wedding Bells. Most of the week before his wedding, Bobby was in the extreme party town of Key West, Florida, sowing his wild oats as a bachelor. A Bloomington attorney had seen an item in the Key West Citizen reporting Bobby's whereabouts and that he'd been hitting the night spots there. Bobby was staying with and partying with one Peppo Vanini, unknown in Bloomington but well-known in Manhattan, where he was co-owner of the popular disco Xenon, whose main competition was Studio 54. The enormous club was located in what was then raunchy Times Square, and had its grand opening in the late spring of 1978. Soon after, Bobby, his brothers Michael and David, and their cousin, John F. Kennedy Jr., had become regulars. The club featured a deafening sound system and had a spaceship that descended from the ceiling. The place was the essence of full-blown Manhattan late 70s, early 80s debauchery nightlife chic. Marijuana permeated the air. White powder was snorted through dollar bills. Men danced with men. Transvestites flaunted themselves. And the odd sex act took place in the darkened playpen section on the mezzanine level and even on the crowded, sweaty dance floor. In that crazy, druggy scene, the young Kennedys rubbed shoulders with other bold-faced names like Andy Warhol, Mick Jagger, Cher, and Robin Williams. Michael Kennedy was often spotted there, hanging out with and playing with the Australian model actress Rachel Ward, according to one of the many photographers who staked out the place for celebrity shenanigans in its heyday. One report had it that Rachel Ward, then 21, had become David Kennedy's girlfriend for some 5 months, had often hung out at the penthouse that he rented on Manhattan's Upper East Side, and was frequently on his arm at Xenon. "We smoked joints now and then," she once told People, for a story headlined, "Friends and Family Rally Around David, the Bright and Troubled Kennedy Rebel." The gorgeous Rachel Ward was quoted saying, "He ate like a pig and didn't take very good care of himself. But he was crazy, with a wonderful sense of humor, and he was always very merry." David had once gotten into a fight at Xenon with Andy Warhol's colleague Fred Hughes. Warhol later noted in his diary that David had told the police after being picked up for buying heroin in Harlem, "I'm David Kennedy. Please don't tell my family. I just want to go back to Hyannis." Bobby loved Xenon and had taken his then-girlfriend, Rebecca Fraser, there a number of times. But no one remembered Emily ever being there with him prior to a pre-wedding celebration. Rob Littell, a close pal of John Jr.'s, who wrote a book about their relationship, recalled that the slain president's namesake, quote, "loved the energy at Xenon and enjoyed being the center of attention." Bobby's bachelor fling host, Peppo Vanini, was a jet-setter, a one-time restaurateur in Europe, and the first of the 4 husbands of the British beauty and actress Victoria Tennant. Her second husband was Steve Martin. Despite his past marriage, rumor had it that Vanini was gay or bisexual, and that in the druggy Xenon scene, anything was possible. Before becoming a partner in Xenon with the former rock promoter Howard Stein, son of a murdered New York loan shark, Vanini ran the King's Club at the Palace Hotel in St. Moritz, and was once described as having the face of a wonderful old roux and the style of a rich playboy uncle. The Kennedy cousins, Bobby and John, were treated like princes by the Italian-Swiss Vanini, who thought of them as the closest thing to royals in America, and he was one to know, reportedly having palled around with the likes of the wild young royals from Monaco, Princess Grace's kids. Stein had once observed that Vanini made overtures to induce them, Bobby and John, into our world. Bobby was older than John and had been around a bit more than him, and Stein considered JFK's namesake, quote, less a disco baby. He didn't leverage his name the way the kids of the famous do in my world. He had star quality, so every time he was there, he got his picture in the papers. While he had no children of his own, Vanini had practically adopted the two young Kennedys, who had lost their fathers to assassins. Unlike Bobby, who had the gay Lem Billings as his companion and overseer, who was willing to do whatever Bobby wanted, John had his very domineering mother to carefully watch over him. Still, Vanini called himself the cousin's disco daddy. His business partner, Stein, described himself as Bobby and John's disco uncle. As one Xenon regular observed years later, Peppo looked out for Bobby and John to make sure their partying didn't get them or the club in trouble, because photographers and gossip column sources and even undercover cops were always around. The photographer, John Roca, then shooting for the New York Daily News, recalled that either Bobby or a member of his entourage, which included other young Kennedys and their pals, had asked us that any photos we shot of Bobby and John at Xenon were to be cleared by Peppo. We said, sure, yeah, right. But we definitely didn't do it. The future lawyer Bobby was fascinated with the criminal background of Stein's father, Ruby, who had had his head chopped off by rival gangsters and his body thrown into New York's Jamaica Bay. Stein once told a writer for New York Magazine that Bobby had a burning interest in hearing the late mobster's story. He recalled that one night at Xenon, Bobby moved close to Stein's ear and whispered, "Tell me about your dad." Stein had a feeling that Bobby might have been a gangster groupie. You say to them, "That man's in the mob," and they light up. "It turns them on to think about me that way," Stein said. He felt it gave him a credit, a certain depth about his roots, even though he had despised his father and was embarrassed by the criminal life he had led. After a battle with kidney cancer, Stein died in 2007 at 62. Vanini had Parkinson's for several years and died in 2012. As a friend noted at the time, New York, London, Paris, Milan, and St. will never be quite the same. As he felt with the death of his surrogate father, Lem Billings, Bobby was said to have been truly saddened when he heard that Peppo, his disco daddy, had passed away. By the Thursday night before the Saturday evening nuptials, Bobby was back in New York City with his pals, who threw a bachelor party for him at Howard Stein's house. The liquor flowed all night long, one of the guests had never forgotten. The party continued at Trax, an uptown rock club, where Emily and her chums made an appearance. As usual, Peter Kaplan was at Bobby's side, and, gazing at Emily, acting as the couple's spokesman of the moment, he offered his opinion about the bride-to-be. "She is lovely. She is beautiful, a very intelligent young woman, really serious and quiet, a fantastic student, and very Midwestern," he told a gossip column reporter. "There's no doubt that she's from Indiana." As many as 200 reportedly showed up for the private party, followed by more celebrating at Xenon, where friends of the couple wore baseball caps inscribed "Bobby and Emily, April 3rd, 1982. By about 4 a.m., it was all over. Emily flew to Bloomington, and Bobby, apparently partied out, took a later U.S. air flight. At LaGuardia Airport, apparently still wired from day after day of celebrating, he had gotten into a tussle with a placard-toting member of the Fusion Energy Party and tore up one of his signs. The organization, headed by Lyndon LaRouche, promoted nuclear power, which Bobby, becoming more interested in environmental issues, was vehemently against. The demonstrator claimed that he had been cornered and heckled, but there were no arrests. At least one blonde, blue-eyed, preppy-looking female reporter for a supermarket tabloid had been tailing the celebrants and later reported, "As soon as Bobby's plane took off, The stewardesses were busy pouring liquor, and after the plane landed in Indianapolis, the 1-hour bus ride from the airport to Bloomington was like a mobile party on wheels. On Friday afternoon, the wedding party finally arrived at the Indiana Memorial Union on the university's campus in Bloomington, delivered by a double-decker IU bus. There, in jeans and a white blouse, was the fresh-faced bride, who had seemingly recovered from the night before, and a tense-looking groom, followed by the Catholic priest, Father Creedon, Peter Kaplan, who replaced the deceased Lem Billings as Bobby's best man, was there, as was Bobby's adventure chronicler, Harvey Blake Fleetwood, the two usual sidekicks. Also leaving the bus were Bobby's cousins, Chris Lawford and Stephen Smith Jr., along with Bobby's brothers, David and Michael, and a slew of others. Many of them were wearing five-and-dime store fake big noses, mustaches, and eyeglasses in order to hide their identities or just to be cute. Others wore "Black is Beautiful" buttons in honor of the bride's maiden name. The slogan was a spin-off of a popular one dating from the 60s Black consciousness movement. A short time later, a limousine pulled up, and the mother of the groom stepped out, smiling and waving to the photographers and reporters, and with two of her young sons, Doug and Rory, in tow. Ethel Kennedy's personal secretary, a harried young woman named Daniel Paris, one of many who had worked for the difficult matriarch, refused to give any details of the wedding schedule when surrounded by reporters. "I still want to have my job on Monday," she said. She had been making some of the advance arrangements for her boss, including the complex plans for a big Friday night wedding rehearsal dinner. The sole representatives of the older Kennedy generation who came to Bloomington for the wedding were Bobby's aunt, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, and his uncle Ted, who happened to be attending meetings in Indianapolis, where he blamed the Reagan administration's economic policies for creating nothing but despair. The press and Bloomington natives were disappointed that Rose, Jackie, Caroline, and John Jr. were no-shows. For early April, the day before and the day of the wedding, Bloomington was bitterly cold and windy. There was even an unverified report that a tornado had touched down in a nearby county, destroying a house trailer and a barn, and power lines and tree branches had fallen over a wide area. If the weather on the eve of Bobby's marriage was any barometer, it would be a stormy union, and it was. Within minutes of their arrival, the Kennedy men did what they usually do at important gatherings of the clan. They got up a game of touch football. It was led by Lawford, but without the groom. Also joining were Bobby's brothers, Michael, Max, and David, his cousin, Stevie Smith, and his pals, Kaplan, Fleetwood, and the Yale-educated lawyer Chris Bartle, who years later co-founded a boutique bottled water company with Bobby. While the third generation and chums played touch, the rotund Ted Kennedy went to the weight room in the university gym, and clad in an IU t-shirt and matching gray gym shorts, did sit-ups and leg lifts and pumped a 10-pound weight. Kennedy groupies followed his every move, and one cute MBA co-ed, who had been ogling the Kennedy contingent closely, later remarked, "They're American royalty. Some of them seem to be bending over backwards to be nice, and some were really demanding and arrogant." On the eve of the wedding, a rehearsal was held in First Christian, a scene that Reverend Ewing is never forgotten because of the high-powered Kennedy vibe. Like everyone else, he was starstruck by the famous clan. Those folks came into the sanctuary, and it was just like a psychic tidal wave of confidence. You could feel this rush, he recalled decades later. They were all these potent individuals, the Kennedy icons, the Shrivers, 15 groomsmen, and 25 bridesmaids. I was sorry that Arnold Schwarzenegger and Maria Shriver weren't there. They were on the guest list, but I guess he was shooting a movie someplace. We had to seat all the bridesmaids in the first 2 rows because we didn't have enough room for that many people to stand up, continued Ewing, who in particular had noticed that the The groomsmen were all so agreeable and cordial. It wasn't until the next day, Saturday, the day of the wedding, that he found out why the atmosphere at the rehearsal and throughout the celebratory weekend was so mellow. And that's because, he said, they were all high on cocaine and booze, revealed Mr. Ewing, a secret he had held closely for decades. They weren't unruly or rowdy or obnoxious or anything. They were just very high, he said. I found that out just because I started to find evidence, and some of them just told me. We were hanging around waiting for things to happen, and they were just talking, and I said, I really appreciate it that you guys are so helpful. And one of them said, oh, well, it's pretty easy when you're as high as we all are. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Ethel Kennedy had assigned her secretary, Danielle Paris, to make arrangements for a feast to be held at Bloomington's upscale public house restaurant following the Friday night rehearsal. The owner, Rudolph Fisher, naturally was thrilled to have the royal family as his customer, especially at a time when business was down because of the recession, which had hit the town like everywhere else in the country. When he got the famous Kennedy's business, he thought, I'm used to cooking for celebrities, so I'm not really nervous about it at all. The chef, however, hadn't researched the client well enough to know that when it came to paying her bills, Bobby's mother was often delinquent, despite her wealth. Fisher would learn the hard way. Bill C. Brown, who owned the building where the restaurant was located, recalled years later that at the dinner, a couple of the Kennedys got a little drunk. That was evident when dueling swords that were part of the restaurant's decor were removed from the wall, and a gaggle of inebriated members of the Klan went out in the parking lot and started sword fighting, said Brown. Alcohol flowed during dinner. Served that night were nearly 90 bottles of wine, in addition to 51 separate drinks, 93 call drinks, 38 after-dinner drinks, and 62 beers. I never saw so many glasses in front of each place setting for different drinks. It was just something else, recalled the minister, Terry Ewing. We had drinks constantly. We started off with Irish whiskey, then moved to this and that and red and white wine. It was fabulous. I can't believe we were able to walk away. I sat next to Ethel, who was patting my leg and kissing me on the cheek. Aside from the bubbly, the wine, and the hard stuff, the celebrants feasted on a variety of hors d'oeuvres. Ethel Kennedy certainly knew how to live the high life, even during a national recession. Following the meal, there were more than 24 toasts, and following each, the Kennedys yelled, "Well said!" And there were a slew of congratulatory telegrams from close family members such as Ethel's pal, the humorist Art Buchwald. Drinking and toasting was a big thing at Kennedy affairs, noted Christopher Lawford. Giving a funny, smart, or passionate toast was pretty much a prerequisite for any sort of base-level credibility in the public speaking and charisma department. Bobby, Ted Kennedy noted, went for humor, which was often off-color, and if that didn't work, he tried to inspire. At the rehearsal dinner, Bobby's brother Joe got up and toasted their late father and Uncle Jack and observed, "We are the fortunate ones. We are the people who are called to help others." Ewing recalled that the most poignant toast had been made by the youngest sibling of the groom, Rory, who also toasted her father, whom she had never known, having been born 6 months after he was assassinated. All had gone off according to plan. The beautifully set tables, replete with round Irish linen tablecloths in Ethel Kennedy's favorite color, pink, which she had loaned the restaurant for the dinner, were in place, right where she'd wanted them, based on seating plans that she had approved. The rich and expensive gourmet meal was a mouth-watering success, and everyone who wanted to got smashed on all the alcohol that was served. According to Fisher, though, the wines Ethel Kennedy had ordered were not very expensive. It was agreed that immediately following the feast, the secretary, Danielle Paris, would meet with Fisher and pay the balance of $7,189.20 on the entire bill of $8,939.80. And the mother of the groom made a special effort to thank Fisher for a job well done. But there was what seemed at the time to Fisher to be a minor change of plan. Paris said it was getting late, and she'd handle the settling of the bill the next morning, the wedding Saturday, at the restaurant. Fisher was fine with that. As the Kennedys were celebrating at the rehearsal dinner, a group of Southern good old boys attending a convention of auctioneers were staying in the IU Student Union, where many of the wedding guests were being put up. By luck, they had a suite next to Bobby's, and had overheard that he was RFK's son and was about to get hitched. Something, they concluded, had to be done to help the boy celebrate on his last night as a bachelor. When he arrived back in his room, the hard-partying auctioneers from Georgia and Tennessee were there to greet him with a raunchy singing telegram and a very special offering. She was a Bloomington belly dancer by the name of Nadira, who had been hired by the conventioneers and offered up to Bobby as their wedding gift. The local columnist, Greg Dawson, who was tailing the groom for a story, recalled that Bobby was thrilled. He said a few words to the dancer in Arabic, and she responded in kind, Dawson noted. Then Bobby joined in the belly dancing, while an unidentified friend who was with him did some push-ups and backflips. Not to be outdone, Bobby had a trick of his own. Stretching out, he placed his feet on a chair, his ass on a small table, and his head on another chair. Then, magically, he slid the table out from under him, with only his head and feet supported by the two chairs, and held it over his head. The auctioneers hooted and hollered at the impressive feat as Bobby got up, jumped on the bed, and led his new friends in a loud rendition of Dixie. Whether the belly dancer had any further interaction with the Kennedy namesake on the eve of his marriage was never revealed because, well, what happens in Bloomington stays in Bloomington. The banner headline in the Bloomington Herald telephone blared, "April Love, Robert Kennedy Jr. and Emily Black wed." The Indianapolis Star shouted, "Bloomington agog over wedding." People magazine rhapsodized, "Back home again in Indiana, Emily Black picks up a freighted name, Mrs. Robert F. Kennedy Jr." And the National Enquirer barked, "Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s weird, wild, and wacky wedding." Despite 40-mile-an-hour wind gusts and a bitter temperature in the mid-40s, some 1,000 bundled-up Bloomingtonians lined the streets around First Christian Church to get a look at what they perceived to be America's royal family. One woman said she was there to see Kennedys, money, and beautiful gowns. Another carried a sign, "Kennedy for President in '84. Looking back years later and recalling the scene, Terry Ewing, the minister, said, "If Jackie and company had been there, it would have been an absolute circus." Instead of coming, she had sent them a wedding gift, antique Chinese plates. The wind was so strong that when the bride stepped out of the limousine in front of the church, she was actually late getting there, her long veil curled around her feet and her recently done hair was suddenly a tangled mess. Members of her party rushed to her aid so that she could make a dignified entrance into the church. In her party was her maid of honor and law school roommate, Alexandra Curry. The matron of honor was Emily's sister, Sarah, who sold real estate in Chicago, and the bridesmaids included Bobby's sisters, Carrie, Rory, Courtney, and Kathleen. Bobby's attendants, in tuxes, one of whom was spotted walking up to the church steps swigging beer from a bottle, the empty of which he put down before walking inside, included the usual suspects, his 6 brothers, and his best friend and best man, Peter Kaplan. A couple of years later, Bobby would serve as Kaplan's best man when he got married. Like Bobby's marriage, Kaplan's too would end in divorce, followed by a second marriage. Bobby would have 3, a record for a Kennedy man. Also with Bobby were his cousins Stevie Smith, Chris Lawford, and Bobby Shriver, who as a teenager had been arrested with Bobby for marijuana possession. And there were longtime friends, among them Bobby's law school pal, Sheldon Whitehouse, who years later became a U.S. Senator, and, I might add, the U.S. Senator who was grilling him really hard this week on Capitol Hill at his Senate confirmation hearing. Pretty memorable exchange between those two. And we still don't know how Senator Whitehouse will ultimately vote. He might be one Democrat who votes for Bobby because of their long, close friendship. It'd be pretty hard to vote no on the guy that you went to his wedding and had been close friends since you were law school students. Actually, another interesting tidbit, Senator Whitehouse was Michael Kennedy's, Bobby's brother's, roommate for a time also. So these two families were very, very close. 3 of Bobby's celebrants were photographed leaving the service looking pretty stoned, and a photograph of them appeared with the National Enquirer story about the wedding. Security around the church was tight. Cops were closely watching the crowd, and plainclothes marksmen were sighted on surrounding roofs. There were armed men on the streets all around the church, recalled Reverend Ewing. I understand that the Kennedy family had hired its own security people. When I walked into the church with my wife and daughter, these 2 guys came running down the aisle towards me with their hands in their coats. "Who are you? Who are you?" I said, whoa, I'm the minister." Bloomington didn't want to become another Dallas or Los Angeles. Some of the security was arranged by the local attorney, Guy Loftman, Emily's friend and former boss. Several days after the wedding, he sent a letter to the chief of the Indiana University Police Department, thanking him for his, quote, seasoned judgment, which prevented delicate situations from becoming problems. But he didn't elaborate on what kind of delicate situations had occurred or been avoided. He also noted the discretion of the chief's force and the cooperation of the Bloomington forces. Some 275 guests were on the list to view the exchange of vows. There were prominent Kennedy acolytes, such as the powerful syndicated columnist Joseph Alsop, Richard and Doris Kearns Goodwin, he a key advisor to JFK and RFK, she the noted historian, the American Football League founder Don Klosterman, who had once been romantically linked to Ethel Kennedy, a top Justice Department aide to RFK, John Siegenthaler, who later served as editor, publisher, and chairman of the Tennessean, JFK and RFK's Boswell, the biographer Arthur Schlesinger, the Academy Award-winning Hollywood producer Sam Spiegel, Xenon's co-owner Giuseppe Peppo Vanini, and his business partner Howard Stein, the American Film Institute founder George Stevens, who annually produced the Kennedy Center Honors, JFK's press aide, Sue Vogelsinger, who was with the president aboard Air Force One when it landed in Dallas on November 22, 1963, and a slew of others. There was still another low-key guest on the list, a chubby-cheeked, bearded, bespectacled man by the name of Don Juhl. That's Juhl, by the way. While he wasn't a Schlesinger or a Siegenthaler, he was, next to the bride, probably one of the most important figures in Bobby's life, and that of his brother David, at that time and later. For Juhl was an addiction counselor from California. His presence on the guest list underscored a dark fact, of which the bride was aware when she tied the knot, that her groom and her new brother-in-law had serious drug problems that had existed since their teens and had been covered up, for the most part, by the Kennedy family and Bobby and David's close friends, many of whom were at the wedding. Juhl reportedly had received $100,000 for his drug rehab work with David, money that was paid out of his trust fund, a form of tough love instigated by David's Uncle Ted, and David was furious. All he wanted was his family's love, and he couldn't get it, said Nancy Alexander, a pal of David's. And David would later say, "I am what I am because I come from a whole line of alcoholics. Just look at how many of us are fucked up. My brother Bobby's a junkie." As a member of Bobby's circle observed, many years later, after David's fatal overdose, Bobby was seriously an addictive personality. Drugs and sex, too. An addictive personality with both of those things that was an unfortunate heritage that had come down from Grandpa Joe, and likely from the Skakels, too. So, when he married Emily, she struck me as being too nice, too quiet and calm to be married to Bobby Kennedy, and I think that ultimately proved to be true. Before the ceremony began, Bobby's Uncle Ted caught everyone's attention when he walked down the aisle to the front of the church on the bride's side, kneeled and crossed himself, and sat down on a pew and prayed. The next day, Sunday, when the church was back to normal and the Kennedy invasion had left town, a woman and her 2 daughters sat in the same pew where Teddy had been and tore out the page from the registry that the famed senator had signed. Unlike many young couples in that era who drafted their own matrimonial vows, Bobby and Emily didn't, even though Father Creedon and I both gave them that opportunity, said Ewing, who also noted that there wasn't anything particularly Catholic in the ceremony that I was a part of. That was because a Catholic ritual had been held in the university's Beck Chapel prior to the service in Ewing's big church downtown. Creedon offered a blessing, and Ewing a welcoming prayer, and each read from the scriptures. Holding hands, Bobby and Emily faced each other and promised, "I will be true to you for all my days." In his homily, Creedon said, "When Jesus walked into a church, a building, and things were not right, when people were huckstering and selling what would not satisfy, he turned the tables over. He acted against the unacceptable. Bobby has that same religious impulse driving him to change things. Emily shares that concern. Her gentleness does not hide the strength of character that is as strong as those trees that populate Bloomington." After the vows had been taken and the bride was given 2 rings blessed by Father Creedon, Ewing thanked the bride and groom's mothers for giving him the opportunity to be a part of their union and wish them well. In the church's choir balcony, the music for the ceremony was played by a group of Indiana University graduate students known as the Rosewood String Trio, but there was no organ music, as requested by the bride, who also rejected the playing of the traditional wedding march. "I never heard anything from any of them ever again," said Father Ewing. Following the wedding ceremony, there was a reception at the University Club, where Bobby and Emily cut a 6-tiered white cake with half a dozen bartenders handling the deluge of drink orders, and a 5-piece combo from Chicago, formerly known as Fast Eddie, supplied the music. Afterward, the happy newlyweds left for their honeymoon. Many in their circle were mystified as to where they had gone. Bobby had mentioned 2 spots, sunny Puerto Rico and drab Deadwood, South Dakota. The small town with the ominous name did have a poignant and very secret meaning. Deadwood was the home of the Kennedy family friend, hotel owner, and former Catholic priest Bill Walsh, who had been counseling Bobby regarding his drug issues. For Reverend Ewing, the highly publicized Kennedy-Black union had changed his professional life. The fallout was truly unusual, he observed in 2013. "I became the most known unknown minister in the state of Indiana. All of a sudden, everybody wanted me to do their stuff. I was doing all these big deal weddings. The richest man in the county, strip mining, highway building, asked me to do his daughter's wedding, the fanciest wedding I'd ever done. It was, he said, even bigger than the Kennedy affair, which he noted was not the most fanciest by any means." It was a decade later when Ewing learned about Bobby and Emily's divorce. "By that time, I knew about Bobby's drug and alcohol abuse," he said. "When I married them, I knew he was doing cocaine. So when I heard the marriage was ending, I thought, well, I'm not surprised, because that's what happens if one member of a couple goes down a destructive road that they can't get back from. and it's not a surprise that the marriage suffers. I told them when we had our marriage counseling session before the wedding that anytime they wanted to talk, to get a hold of me. Obviously, they didn't do that, so when I heard they divorced, I found myself thinking, boy, Bobby, you screwed up. There was an immediate dark footnote to Bobby Kennedy and Emily Black's wedding. The public house owner, Rudy Fisher, who arranged the big rehearsal dinner celebration at his restaurant, couldn't get paid. Attempts by Fisher to reach Ethel Kennedy, who had a reputation for stiffing vendors, or her secretary, had failed. On April 20th, he sent a registered letter to Hickory Hill, 1147 Chainbridge Road, McLean, Virginia, 22101. In his respectful Dear Mrs. Kennedy letter, he wrote, "We are a small business, and our terms are net 7 days. I'm sure you understand the pressure of business in these trying times, and we need the cash flow to pay our suppliers. Again, I want to express our appreciation for having the pleasure of serving you and your family." When he got no response, he threatened to call the Johnny Carson show and go on TV to, quote, "tell the world what a bunch of cheapskates the Kennedys were," he told a friend. Fisher claimed he had been told by a member of the Klan, "It should have been a privilege to serve the Kennedys, and you shouldn't be charging for the dinner at all." On September 1st, 1982, Bloomington's Herald Telephone newspaper ran a front-page banner headline, "The honeymoon's over, public house suing Ethel Kennedy for $7,189 rehearsal dinner bill." The embarrassing lawsuit clearly worked because by mid-September, RFK's widow paid the 5-month-old bill with interest. The excuse for the lateness came from one of the Kennedy spokespersons, claiming a secretary had misplaced the bill. The public house eventually went out of business, having filed for bankruptcy. And I think that's a good place to stop. That is chapter 22. And in the next episode, we will get into chapter 23 and the doomed Kennedy-Black marriage. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm really loving this book, and I will see you in the next episode. It'll be episode 10 of RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and the Dark Side of the Dream by New York Times bestselling author Jerry Oppenheimer. Until then, I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.